So let me introduce the panel. Today we have Josie, Godfrey, and Lindsay representing Realise Advocacy. Many of you might know Josie, who was the director of a highly specialized technologies program at NICE. Heidi Livingstone is joining us from NICE, and she's representing public involvement program, and specifically patient involvement program. We also have Eric Lowe, who also worked with NICE extensively and works with many companies and organizations advising on patient engagement. We have Rick Thompson, who is the CEO of Findacure, a rare disease organization committed to finding treatments and improving quality of life of patients with rare diseases. And we have Francis Pank, representing the industry from Global Market Access of Orchard Therapeutics. So on this note, I'd like to pass this to Josie to introduce Realise Advocacy and today's event.
Thank you. Oh, I've gone too far. Thank you, Lisa. It's so good to be here and talking to such fantastic people about a topic that I've been talking to many of you about for the last 10 years, I think, since I've been working in HTA. So I'm going to introduce, set the scene, and talk about what HTA is, why patient involvement is important, and then pass over to Lindsay to talk a little about some of the challenges we face. So why do we even have HTA, or health technology assessment? Well, it's part of the picture, the process of making decisions and approving new treatments for patients. We have regulators, so think MHRA, the FDA in the US, apologies for all the acronyms, and the EMA in Europe. And they're really focusing in on whether the treatment is safe, whether or not it works, and whether it can be consistently produced to a high quality, whether the dose or the treatment for one patient is going to be same quality as the next dose for the next patient. They're not so much looking at how effective it is, or whether it's actually something that is needed in a given health system. And that's where HTA comes in, health technology assessment. So we have organizations like NICE who look, not just does it work, but how effective is it? They try to see how good is this treatment and whether it's good value for money, given everything else that is happening in the health system and given the finite resources of any health system. They're looking at whether it's good value for money. And increasingly in recent years, probably the last 9 or 10 years, whether or not something is affordable. Well, what's the budget impact on a given health system? There is an overlap, increasing overlap with the interests of what some of us know as payers. So for England, think NHS England. If you're in the US, you might be thinking of Medicaid, Medicare, or insurers. And they are also, somewhat interested in how effective a product is, but very much focused on that value for money and that affordability as well. So within that HTA step, health technology assessment, I'm not going to read out the long quote on the screen. You can read that at your leisure. But just to point out that different things are taken into account in different systems. They almost certainly will look at the effectiveness of the treatment. They might look at the costs, the ethical implications, the social impacts of a new treatment or a condition, as well as the wider implications for patients, relatives and caregivers, and the general population or the taxpayer. So where do patients fit in? I mean, we could argue, we could probably all of us spend the rest of this webinar arguing whether or not there should be HTA, what it should look like, what the role should be, what things should be taken into account. But the reality is we're here living under a current system. There will be some changes, but it's not likely to be completely thrown out in the next few years. So we all have to work within it. We all have to respond to what's in front of us. And patients are absolutely fundamental to that. So I've worked in health technology assessment for rare conditions or innovative therapies for about 10 years or so. And I've seen time and again the role patients can play. And I see their contribution very much falling into one of two buckets. It's important to focus on both. The first bucket being evidence, and the second being insight. And they are slightly different. The evidence can be very tangible, it could be quantitative data, it could be how many patients, where were they treated, what are their costs, what are their needs. It might be qualitative data, still evidence, but also we have that insight, that lens of looking at the data, looking at the evidence brought by clinicians, brought by companies, and saying, what does this really mean? what does this really mean for patients? What does it really mean for their families? Which is why I like the graphic on this slide. We can look at things in very different ways. And I know Frightes, Heidi, and probably the rest of the panel have all seen the difference that patients can make. I'll just give one example before I hand over to Lindsay, because I'm keen to keep this moving towards the discussion. I'm thinking of one very rare condition, very debilitating condition with no previous treatment and very little known about it. And what we found, Frances might remember this, we found there was a disconnect between the clinical data that was coming through from the trial, which didn't look that impressive. I mean, it was good, but it didn't blow your mind. And then what we were hearing from the clinicians, that actually this was transforming lives. And when we heard from the patients themselves, when we saw that patient evidence, heard those patient insights, it became really clear that there were things the clinical trial hadn't picked up on, that perhaps hadn't been aware or so. Particularly the impact on endurance, on fatigue. So not so much interested in can you walk X number of meters in 6 minutes, but what does that do to you? Does that mean you're wiped out for the rest of the day or 2 days to recover? Or does it mean that actually you can walk X meters and you can then still go back to work or go back to school? You can still carry on with your life. And that really made us think about it in a very different way and changed the whole dynamic of the discussion. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Lindsay, the former Chief Exec of Metabolic Support UK, to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you've seen and you've experienced, Lindsay. Thank you. I can't hear you, Lindsay.
That's a great start. Thanks for setting the scene so well, Josie. It's great to see so many people here at this webinar. It really is. And I'm really excited about the discussion that we can have later on. So those of you that know me, I'm the former Chief Exec of Metabolic Support UK. So in the last sort of 6 years, I've had sort of direct experience really of helping to advocate for patient groups who found themselves going through the NICE process, and also working with industry who are also in that position. And there's lots of people on this webinar today actually, but yeah, I'm definitely not the only one that has got this direct experience, so that's brilliant. And in my experience, it is a very, very steep learning curve for a patient group to find themselves in this situation and to know exactly what to do and how they can have an impact in the process. And I think for me, this is where the drive to set up Realise Advocacy with Josie. I think there is a real lack of support, is my position on this, to help and guide patient groups through this process. And I don't mean a lack of theoretical support or information about the process. I mean actually helping patient advocacy groups put one foot in front of the other and know exactly how to navigate this, depending on their own personal circumstances and situations. For me, the challenges come down to two categories really, and the first one is what I'm really interested in hearing about today. The first one I think is an attitude, and a challenging attitude of that patient involvement and patient participation in this process is very limited, that it isn't necessarily essential, but it's a nice to have. And I think that for me is a challenge that I've recognised during my experiences of going through this process. So I'm really keen to hear from other stakeholders and other people on this webinar today what they think about that in terms of an attitude. And then the second category for me really is about practicalities. And, you know, people just genuinely don't know how to participate. You know, it's very technical, it's very difficult. Patient organisations have told me that it's very expensive for them to participate if they want to have an actual real impact, you know, if they want to do surveys or they want to put together a really good submission. It's very time consuming, it's emotionally draining. You know, this is probably the biggest thing that a patient group will ever go through, you know, a treatment for their condition. And I think that there is lots of challenges and barriers because of the type of process and because of how technical it is. However, going back to my first challenge around attitude, I think if the attitude was one where it was, you know, agreed that it was fundamental to have and essential to have patient participation at the heart of these types of processes, then I think some funding and some hard work by some experts might be able to solve a lot of the other challenges that are on this screen today. So I'm not going to go into any more detail on the challenges because I know that a lot of you on this webinar will have had experiences just as unique as mine, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. So I'm now going to hand over to Heidi, who has the job of describing what NICE's current approach to patient involvement is. Thanks, Heidi.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. So I'm Heidi. I work at NICE. I support patient organisations and patient experts. I've been doing this around 10 years through our drugs appraisals and also our rare diseases, the highly specialised technologies. So I'll try and be as quick as I can on this for you. So first of all, this slide is really busy, for which I apologise, but I hope it encompasses most things. If you look at the bottom, we have a lot of patient involvement throughout the process, and we have 3 patient stakeholders really. We have our lay members of our committees who are equal committee members, but often come from a patient background. We then have patient organisations who are involved throughout, so they're in the green below, whereas the lay members are in the pink. And we also have individual patient experts who are in the blue. So that's a bit leery, but it just gives you that picture. And you can, as a patient organisation, you can be involved throughout, but if you don't wish to be, you pick and choose. But obviously, I would very much prefer it if you were involved throughout. So then on to the arrows across the middle of the screen. This is the whole process. So I will start from the scoping stage, which is actually setting the question. It's really important we have patient input here. Scoping looks at the condition or disease, it looks at the treatment, it looks at the comparators, and it looks at the outcomes. So it's really important to hear from you what the comparators are, if indeed there are any, and whether they're acceptable and real comparators for patients and their families, or if there isn't any, or if there is a reason you wouldn't use them. Equally, the outcomes, as Josie's already said, it's really important to hear this from patients because quite often things are clinically measured, and that might not be what's really, really important to people and their families. So that's scoping, really important we get that right. Then we go on to the next big chunk, which is the evidence submission. We take evidence submissions from the pharma company and all the other stakeholders, including patients. In fact, we can't go ahead without the evidence from the pharma company. So for the patient organisation submissions, this is much more developed than the scope, and we want to hear about lived experience from surveys, from interviews, from, you know, multiple ways that you can find the information to give to us. This then goes to an independent academic review group who looks at all the evidence submissions and critiques them and helps to come up with some questions before the committee meeting. At that point, there's then another consultation for our stakeholders, and we start to include the patient experts. So there's often now a meeting between the experts, patient and clinical, some of the committee members, and also the NICE staff as a kind of pre-discussion to work through some of these areas before the committee meeting. Those of you on this webinar who have participated in our HSTs, you won't have done this yet. This is newer. So if you're a bit puzzled, that's why. Then on to the committee meeting, which includes the experts. That goes through all of the evidence and addresses specific questions. The experts are there to answer questions, but also participate in the discussions. After that, unless it's an out and out yes for the entire population, which it often isn't at this stage, if it is, you skip the arrows on that slide and you skip a few weeks, and we have guidance earlier. If it's not an out and out yes at that point, so that might mean it's a yes for a smaller population, or it might mean that the committee can't say yes at that point. That can feel quite alarming, but actually what that flags up is that the committee needs either more evidence because there's gaps in the evidence. There is a very high level of uncertainty, those obviously go hand in hand, and that it isn't yet cost effective. So within that consultation, we're looking to plug those gaps. Obviously, throughout this time, the pharma company can also talk to the payers that Josie described earlier and set a different price. That's sometimes relevant as well, or a discount. And any gaps in the evidence might be plugged by any of the stakeholders. After that consultation, there is another committee meeting to discuss the consultation outcome. Often we don't have experts at that committee meeting. We don't like to include people when it's tokenistic, or have them in for a meeting if we don't have specific questions for them. However, if there are questions that come out of that consultation that we need experts for, we very much do invite them back. After that, there is the final draft guidance called a final appraisal document. And quite often this might be a different outcome from after the first committee meeting. And I went back and I looked at our statistics that we publish on our website earlier this week to see roughly how many we say yes to. And the current rate is that we say yes to about 83% of our technology appraisals and highly specialised technologies. Actually, it's higher for highly specialised technologies that come through NICE. So that's quite a good yes rate. Right at the very end, there's also the ability to appeal. Now, this is slightly unusual if you're used to legal appeals. This is very much about, it's not about whether you agree or disagree, although obviously that's why you put in an appeal. It's about specific criteria, such as maybe you think NICE didn't follow its process properly, and therefore if that appeal point is overturned, the decision isn't changed, but it goes back to that particular step in the process. So we have support for patient organisations and individuals. We have me or one of my colleagues available for every single one of our topics. We have a set of, we have guides, submission guides, templates. Since we've been doing the pandemic, or since we've had the pandemic, we've been doing monthly Zoom inductions for patient organisations, and you're all really welcome. Just be in touch and sign up. We also do the same now with patient experts. We bring them all together once a month. Our patient experts and our patient organisations, and in fact the general public, can watch meetings online because they're currently virtual. And I'm also really happy, as are my colleagues, if you have draft surveys and if you want us to read them, really happy to do that. Likewise with draft submissions. And right at the very end, so for some of our medicines, the ones that go through the HSTs, we also now have started providing a feedback letter because we know how important it is to you to know what's helpful and what isn't helpful. I'll pass on to Lisa now. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Heidi. And now I would like to give the floor to Eric, to Francis, and to Rick to share their opinions. So Eric, please, you go next.
Thanks, Lisa. And I'll try and be brief, and certainly my intention is not to repeat the good things that have been said already, so I'll try and move the discussion forward a little bit. I think to start off with, I think we should recognise the fact that great efforts have been made to involve patients in HTA. I think that certainly from a UK lens, the HTA bodies have worked really hard to involve patients, and I think Heidi's slide there, I think, demonstrates that well. I'll come back to that slide in a second. That's not to say that things are perfect. I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, but I think sometimes HTA comes in for a lot of criticism in terms of how they involve patients, and some of that I think is fair and justified, and I think some of it is really a bit misguided. So I think in order to try and unpick what needs to happen with patient-involved HTA, I think it really is about getting consensus on the definition of the problem. and the opportunity. And I don't think we've done that sufficiently yet. So that's just something that maybe Josie and Lindsay can take forward through their new ventures, getting that multi-stakeholder consensus and co-create some solutions to the problems. I think from a NICE perspective, not just because Heidi's on this call, and I like Heidi a lot, I think if you look at the totality of the ways in which patients can get involved in a NICE appraisal, I think NICE are a leader. Again, it's not that things are perfect, so don't say I'm thinking things are all good. It's not. But if you look across Heidi's slide, there's so many opportunities for patients in theory to get involved. And I think you missed a couple of things as well, Heidi, because I think that the early scientific advice is another spectacular opportunity for patients to get involved. And to the extent that is possible, Office of Market Access type meetings as well are really, really important, because it's often that these earlier engagement opportunities in trying to shape the decision problem early, to critique the value proposition early, and I think for patients to contribute to shaping evidence development, it is actually where the potential success in patient involvement in HTA may in fact lie. But I think in general terms, I think, you know, we kind of need to understand better if patient groups and patients understand where they can get involved in the process, but also how to optimize that involvement. Because I myself have taken part in a lot of appraisals and been given the opportunity, but I'm not sure I've made the most of it, because just not understanding exactly what I kind of need to do. I think there's also questions around what does NICE do with the evidence that you get from patient groups, and I guess where in the decision making or deliberative discussion process does that information and evidence show up, and what role does it play? Is it around setting context? Is it around having an understanding of a therapeutic area that's very, very important? I've seen the consequences throughout a NICE appraisal where at scoping or the ERG technical team committee chairs don't understand the nuances within a disease, and that can have really big consequences for everybody, not just on patients. So I think there's a lot of work to do around the sort of nature of involvement, where that involvement will have the greatest impacts. And I think when so much of the decision, somewhat crudely, is around the economic model and the evidence submission, and all other things appear at the periphery, if something's not plausibly cost effective and if the uncertainties are not within reasonable bounds, there's very little that patient groups can do. So I think it's about trying to focus in on where that patient input has that win-win in terms of usefulness to NICE and decision makers, and also for patients to feel like in groups that the time they've invested in an appraisal, which I think Josie and Lindsay said is not gone to waste. Because having been there myself, participating in an appraisal, it probably put us 5 years behind ultimately in our business plan, because it was a 2-year appraisal and we did nothing else. So the opportunity costs of patient groups taking part in an appraisal in which they may have no material impact means that their services to patients otherwise may be damaged, and it may be more harmful than helpful to patients for patient groups to kind of take part. So I think it's about really trying to understand where that involvement will have the most impact. And my view is that if we can focus that on the context and the disease knowledge, but then what contribution can patient groups make to understanding the economic model, and to understanding and conceptualizing and thinking about the evidence in the context of what it means to kind of patients, because that's where the decisions are normally made. The other thing to think about as well is we tend to think about HTA as a single point, but actually it's one point in a long system of decision making. And I think we need to think about HTA as not just that point between regulatory and commissioning, but an integral part in a evidence generation, medicines optimization process, where HTA can look back to evidence development and look forward to medicines optimization and actually connect up. And I think patient groups really have quite a remarkable opportunity to get involved early And I think, you know, you've got this saying rubbish in, rubbish out, and it's true with HTA. There's a limit to what HTA and methods and processes can do to fix the problems of poor evidence. And I think if patient organizations and patients think about HTA in a slightly broader sense and find ways to influence evidence generation to improve the inputs into the HTA appraisal process, that will undoubtedly have a bigger impact on the decision and patients than just participating like a barbarian at the gate trying to get in to influence the decision. So I think there's a lot to think about and how we think about HTA and then that broader definition of HTA where patients and patient groups can fit in. And I think that Josie mentioned it, is that I would kind of quite like to stop and start again and redefine what HTA is and how it should work, but it isn't going to happen. So I think it's sort of in its current format, it's here to stay, and we've got to think creatively and collaboratively and kind of co-create solutions around how we involve patients and actually start to change the optics where the HTA should be defined as a sort of patient-driven construct in which the health economists and the evidence generators are invited and have to get in, as opposed to the other way around, where it seems to be something that happens independently, sometimes with patients, and we're trying to get in, we're trying to get a kind of seat at the table. So I think there's probably some evolution that we can do to get HTA generally to a kind of better place. And the one thing I would say from at least my experience is that the things I've been able to do outside of the actual appraisal has had a bigger impact on the appraisal than actually taking part in the appraisal. So being that honest broker, doing that stakeholder engagement, trying to horizon scan and risk stratify everything and engage with stakeholders before, during and after an appraisal actually has had a greater success than actual this physical, if you will, participation, particularly in committee meetings, which, you know, if there's anything that needs to dramatically improve, it's a committee meeting. And I know that a lot of stuff has gone into to sort of make it more of an iterative process and to take the jeopardy and the burden out of a committee meeting, but it kind of passes you by a little bit. If you're a kind of patient, you've got to fight to get in. I think often they're poorly chaired, and I think sometimes the lay representative, you wonder why they're there, because they very rarely speak up for patients or grab the attention of the chair or anything like that. So I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that can improve massively in terms of how patients are kind of involved and kind of represented in HTA, and hopefully during this discussion we can have some debate around that.
Cool. I think it's time for me to dive in. Thanks, Eric. That was fascinating and a huge range of cool points. So my name is Rick. I'm CEO of a rare disease charity here in the UK called Findacure, and we work pretty much day in, day out with rare disease patient groups. We're helping them to form, to grow and professionalize. And so given that context, it's probably fair to say that my fundamental position in this is the patient group opinion matters hugely in the HTA process. They are setting the context for the whole data that we're looking at and assessing what's going on. Context is king when we're assessing data, right? And as Josie and everyone else has already alluded to, you know, the patient contribution provides that crucial lens through which you can view and assess the clinical evidence that we're assessing in HTA to understand what that actual impact is on individuals who are going to be taking that medicine and experiencing it on the ground. And that lens can be transformative in how people view that evidence, transformative in the decisions that are made. So we can't understate the value of that. I suppose what I'd like to try and bring at this point is something to drill down on what Lindsay was talking about really, and to flip that context, look at the context of the groups who are giving that evidence. What context are they working in? Because there is clearly a huge resource deficit when you're talking about lots of patient groups. Day in, day out, the groups we're working with have a huge spread in size, in skill, and in time that they can give. A patient group could be an individual that's running a Facebook group that speaks to a few patients with a condition. and it can be a well-funded, large international charity with a network around the globe, and those two ends of the spectrum have everything in between as well. And to ask the same thing of those two very different scales of groups is a big demand, and it's crucial that we recognise the context of the groups that you're working with in this process and try and provide some resources, support and guidance to help them move through the process effectively, because the burden and the impact of taking part in these HTAs for any of these groups can feel very huge, but particularly when you're that small individual leading a small Facebook group, suddenly with the power to make influence the decision on whether a drug is going to benefit those people is approved or not. And I think it's really important not to underestimate that impact. Critically as well, when we consider what Eric's just said, which I fully agree with, which is actually the place for patients to engage with the HTA process isn't just in the appraisal conversation, but it is far beyond that. It's far earlier. It is helping to think about how we can define what evidence should be collected and generated and assessed for the condition that we're working in. It is defining the clinical endpoints. It is helping to encourage and drive the research into a condition in the first place. It's making sure the right questions are asked in the right way and data is collected in a way that's meaningful to individuals. That is a huge role and responsibility that the patient groups themselves want to try and deliver and act in, because this matters more to them than anyone. And when you're working in a condition, particularly in a chronic condition, particularly in a rare condition, the impetus, the championing from those patient groups is crucial to move things forward. But there's a huge responsibility with that, and I'm pleased to see this increasing recognition throughout the whole drug development process, like in the HTA process, that we need to see patient groups and patient influence in that position. But what I want to see next is a recognition of the cost, the time, the effort that's required from them, and that we shouldn't just assume because it's in their benefit they'll do it all for free, when they're also looking after caring for people within the condition, live with the condition themselves, trying to run a normal job, make money and make ends meet. There should be some recognition of the needs that they have, the needs to have good understanding of the process, the need to generate confidence and self-belief that they can actually stand up and deliver this themselves and recognise their own expertise, and fundamentally needs to have resources and finances to deliver that effectively. So that's kind of my message really. I want people to see more support for the patient groups to do this process well, more support for those patient groups to grow and to deliver what we all know they can achieve effectively. And yeah, hopefully we can see more of that in the future to make sure we can make the most of these opinions. So I'll pass on to Francis now to give the kind of industry perspective on this area.
Great, thank you, Rick, and also thanks to Rick and Eric actually for such a comprehensive overview of the issues. Right. So I'm Francis Pang. I'm responsible for health economics and access at Orchard Therapeutics, which is an ex vivo gene therapy company focused on rare diseases. I'm a health economist by training, and I started my career at the University of York in health economics, and also, I've been the healthcare industry representative on the NICE committee for the last 8 years. So what I wanted to do is actually talk about some of the practical sort of issues, from the industry perspective. And first of all, I'd like to say that I wanted to respond to Lindsay's comment actually regarding the patient perspective being a nice to have. I mean, it's certainly not a nice to have now, right? And I think having that partnership between industry and patient organizations in the generation of evidence is really, really critical now, right? And the healthcare, the actual perspective of payers, such as NICE, is often very narrow. It's a narrow healthcare perspective, and what you want to do is actually try to expand that perspective, right? And sort of illustrate, aspects of the disease burden, such as impact on daily activities, impact on social functioning, perhaps the time investment in caring, the financial impact actually on the family unit, actually in terms of caring for a person with a particular disease, right? And also there could be limiting career opportunities actually for caregivers, and of course there is the physical and emotional impact. Now with evidence generation, right, there's always the good intentions actually to be as comprehensive as possible. I mean, it's impossible to generate the perfect data set. And also companies work within constraints when it comes to designing clinical trials. It's a highly controlled, highly regulated space, right? And, you know, the FDA will have its own requirements. The European Medicines Agency will have its own requirements. Trying to reconcile those requirements, you know, into a study is, you know, is challenging and you know, in itself. And then, of course, you know, you have to balance that against cost and of running the study, and that can be quite you know, difficult for, you know, a number of companies. You know, certainly the smaller kind of like biotechnology sort of companies, the startups, for example. Right. So inevitably there will be gaps in the data set, right? And this is where, you know, the patient input, you know, will be very, very useful. You know, collection of data outside of the main clinical trial program, right? And you know, whereas individual testimonies or anecdotes, you know, are useful, you know, when it comes to health technology assessment, surveys are probably more powerful and persuasive. I mean, we live in a evidence-based, you know, environment, and as Josie mentioned, it's here to stay. And you know, having said that, surveys can be quite difficult to conduct, and I think Lindsay kind of alluded to some of that in her opening remarks, and also can be quite expensive to conduct as well. And you know, from experience, to be done properly, you know, the survey has to be sort of validated for the clarity of the content or the questions that are being asked. Also, that the tone has to be, you know, appropriate. And that's where we would engage, you know, patient advocates actually to help validate the survey. And the intention is really to obtain the best quality data that you can, right? You know, from experience, recruitment into surveys can take a very long time, actually, and certainly, you know, if it's a rare disease, for example, and you may need to go cross-national, right? So, and if you go cross-national with you know, for a survey, then there are other issues. I mean, you've got the language issue, of course. You've got if you're intending to you know, have a quality of life instrument, you know, incorporated into your survey, then they're kind of like licensing issues, and that also, you know, cost money, right? And hence also ensuring that you actually have the coordination between the different patient organizations, you know, can be, you know, is something that you need to think about. And you know, what I would say is that, you know, having conducted some of these surveys, you know, together with patient organizations in the last couple of years, I mean, caregivers are very busy people. And from a recent study, you know, caregivers spend on average 17 to 18 hours per day on caregiving activities, right? And, you know, if you think about your sleep for 7 days, that's a 24-hour, you know, activity. And so there could be difficulties in terms of actually finding time to participate. And certainly, you know, we've been through this, we're still going through this COVID you know, pandemic. And, you know, we found that it's been even more and more difficult to recruit caregivers actually to take part in these particular surveys. Now, when it comes to surveys, certainly appreciate that it can be quite difficult to recruit, and you're only ever likely to be doing the survey once, right? So you have to have a very thoughtful, reflective approach, you know, because you may not get another opportunity. Where industry can really help is actually with the mechanics of the data collection. I mean, there are a number of sort of agencies out there that could help with, you know, the you know, ethics approval, you know, the actual is it perhaps interviews, perhaps organizing the licenses and so forth, and also with the data cleaning and the analysis. I think what Eric mentioned earlier was about you know, these health economic models, these fancy calculations. You know, they are invariably based on assumptions, right? And then one of the main assumptions is you know, is actually the health utility data, right? And this is where caregivers can, you know, be very helpful in terms of defining health states for valuation for the generation of quality adjusted life years. And then, you know, sometimes, you know, if these utilities are you know, they can be validated by caregivers and patients, and certainly updated or revised, you know, certainly from patient testimonies, you know, if it's felt that a disease is actually worse than than what's been actually been captured or measured. You know, I think another challenge really from kind of an industry perspective is that patient, you know, surveys, you know, don't really kick off, or there is no, the interest in patient surveys doesn't really take place until you know, the asset or therapy has actually moved along the development pathway, and hence it might be quite difficult to get the evidence generation off the ground, you know, like 5 or 6 years before, you know, the regulatory approval of the product, and have that data in a timely manner, you know, actually for, you know, educating or actually promoting awareness of the actual disease condition. So I'd like to say, you know, in terms of concluding, you know, the patient perspective is not, you know, a nice to have, it's the must have. And I think collaboration early on is, you know, collaboration early on, you know, and is really, really key. Can take many forms, you know, including sort of scientific advice, which Eric has, you know, Eric and Rick have mentioned. But again, you know, there are practicalities involved, and you know, evidence generation is a highly regulated activity when it comes to clinical trials, and hence, you know, you may need to conduct surveys, and those present their own issues too. So, yeah, I'll, you know, stop here, and I'll hand you back to Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and wonderful panel and very good points. I would like to invite questions. Please raise your hands and turn your cameras on to ask the question. But I would like to kick off the discussion with perhaps not a very easy question. I realize most of speakers are working in the field of rare diseases, but patient engagement is very important regardless of the condition that we're speaking. And of course, lobbying for highly profiled diseases could be a lot stronger. There's more funding, there are more voices, and certainly fewer voices for each rare disease. So any questions, comments in terms of, are there any differences? Are there any advice if you're representing a rare disease versus non-rare disease if you're a patient or a carer?
So I can start if you like, Lisa. Give everyone else a chance to think. So reflecting on this, because we are a rare disease heavy panel, it's true, but I think most of us have at least some experience outside of the world of rare diseases. And for me, there are certain, probably 3 key differences. So the first, when we're talking about sort of non-rare conditions, there's obviously often a lot more known about those diseases. If we think about a really important role of the patient involvement being helping with that context about a disease and that understanding of a disease, a lot more is probably known about, say, diabetes than is known about Batten's disease, for example, when they go before a NICE committee. So there's a high level of understanding. There's also, as you alluded to, a much broader pool of patients. In rare diseases, if you survey your patients, and then someone else surveys your patients, and someone else surveys your patients, there's still only maybe 100 patients in the country, and they are very, very over-researched or over-questioned sometimes about their condition and the impact of that. So, you know, that is a fatigue, and that is a demand that is not faced, again, by something like diabetes with millions of people to call from, and also far more clinical experts to call on. And then they're likely to have more resources. You know, non-rare disease patient organisations, typically much bigger, well established, with an awful lot more money. Think of Cancer Research UK or Alzheimer's. Still very busy, still huge workloads, but a lot more resources. And what that would enable them to do, I think, is start earlier and think bigger. So actually they could really get some fantastic data, some evidence that could think about, okay, what's coming up in the next few years? If you've got that headspace, how are we seeing gene therapies coming through? Are we seeing treatments coming through for earlier stages of the condition? Do we have the data around that? Have we been focusing on later stages of the disease? We think Alzheimer's, for example, and therefore really being able to pull resources together, pull people together, and get ahead of it quite often we see these very small rare disease patient organisations who may only even become established once a treatment is being developed, once that disease is a little bit better understood and patients start to find each other. But they're quite often on the back foot all the way through. So they can be, you know, really quite different. I'm going to let other people come in and see if they agree with me or not.
Josie, it's Eric here. I'm just going to jump in. I might be a bit too provocative here, but it'll get the discussion going. You talked about sort of big organizations, small organizations. I mean, I've seen some brilliant things happen from small organizations and won people bands. I've seen some really terrible things from big organizations that have got more money than you can shake a stick at. But just, you mentioned Cancer Research UK, and there's probably not somebody on here from CRUK. Do you think they do enough to help in HTA, given their massive resources and albeit through a cancer lens? They fund a massive amount of academic research, and you have to ask the question, what contribution does the results of that academic research play in solving uncertainty and contributing to access? So again, you know, we often think about patient involvement through the lens of, you know, are we getting a seat at the nice table? But it's actually much broader than that. And actually, if all the rare cancer charities and rare disease charities said to CRUK and Alzheimer's Research UK, guys, you need to change your strategy and how you fund research, and actually what contribution you make to medicine's access and medicine's optimization, we would have a bigger impact on access.
Thank you, Eric. Heidi, if you'd like to continue this dialogue, and then we have a question from Emily.
Yes, I would. I recognise both what Josie and Eric have said. So from my point of view, when we first started doing HSTs at NICE with Josie, my preconception was very much that, oh, this was going to be really hard to get people involved. This would be really hard. But actually, I found that the small organisations, the rare diseases, are incredibly passionate, incredibly well informed, and absolutely phenomenal. And what they lack in experience in the HTA field, they more than make up for in other ways. And I guess for me, with wearing my HTA hat, for the bigger organisations, it's kind of easier because they have one person who will liaise with NICE and knows the system inside out and backwards. So that makes it really easy for them in that sense. Whereas when we see something that is really, really rare, there is this phenomenal wave, and I think Eric has described it, and also Lindsay and Rick, about having to get your head around what you're having to do, what needs to be known, and so on. And any help that we can give organisations or individuals with that has got to be great. But in terms of their actual input, it's phenomenal, and there's not sort of some kind of ratio there. It is breathtaking. And I do actually sometimes wonder whether some of the bigger, more established organisations could learn something from this, but I don't know quite how we would harvest that for them.
Thank you, Heidi. Fantastic suggestion. So Emily, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thanks, Lisa. It's an observation, really, and really thanks to the panelists for a very interesting introduction to this area. And Eric, I agree with you that the economic model, the decision is all around that, and at times other things can feel periphery. And your suggestion that patient groups can get involved early on, I absolutely agree with, and I think that there is a lot of opportunity within the NICE structure to do that. But I think that is a massive undertaking, right? So let me just quickly explain about Project Hercules. So we got together a few years ago to try and help companies build the evidence needed for HTA decisions, and it was disease-specific evidence. And what we've done is actually huge. We've redefined the natural history model. We've developed our own quality of life metric, and we've developed our own economic model that can be tailored to each company's specific requirements. And we did this in order to try and minimize as much as possible the uncertainties that companies face when they come to HTA. NICE are on the steering group. They've been fantastic and very supportive throughout the process. We've got 11 pharmaceutical companies. We've got patient organizations from all over the world taking part on this. We've got Professor Ron Akehurst, who sits on NICE committees, who's been guiding us and advising us all the way through. And Josie is the strategic director for the program, which is, to be honest, why it's such an amazing success. But I think that offers a really powerful way forward to embed the patient voice within the language that HTA needs. Because as a history graduate, I found, I've been on a crash course in drug development, and it's the HTA element of it, with all of the language and the technicality and the complications that surround it, that is such a barrier to patient involvement. And whilst I agree with you, Eric, that patients do need to get involved, that is such a huge undertaking, and I wonder, how do we encourage that in a way that will add value? Because I feel like we've done it with Project Hercules, but that was a multi-million-pound project that took several years. Ideally, I'd love all organisations, all disease areas to do that. But if it's not that level of involvement, what is it that realistically patients can do at those areas that will make a difference?
Yeah, I don't know if I can come back on that, Elisa. I think, Emily, I completely agree, and I think the Hercules model sort of sits at the pinnacle. And I think that there's a couple of things I would say is that to have a material impact, it doesn't need to be Hercules. I think that's the best and most comprehensive example. But I think if you think about it in a pyramid, it's about trying to, so a lot of the advice I give to organizations, and I've done myself in organizations, is find that thing you can do that could be transformational. And it might be around making a particular decision or a tweet about a clinical trial design. An FDA clinical trial design can actually publicize the limitations of an FDA designed study. So when I think about what Francis said about the difficulties in generating evidence, is that, and it's not a pushback to Francis, but it's FDA pressures on study design is not an excuse for a poorly designed study. And so we don't, that's where patients, I think, can impact, is understanding what a poorly designed study looks like and what the downstream consequences of that will be beyond an FDA decision maker, and trying to put pressure on both the FDA and the company to say, this is not acceptable, this is barely ethical, because it's going to deny access to patients in huge markets. So I think I completely agree with you, Emily, and we'd love everybody to do Hercules. It's not possible, but there's other things in that pyramid, in that early stage pyramid, that should be accessible to more and more patients and more patient organizations. And that's where I think the focus needs to shift. I don't think we should take the focus away from better involvement actually in the HTA appraisal, but we need to shift it much more earlier on and figure out where patients and patient organizations can meaningfully contribute in a way that is accessible, which Hercules unfortunately isn't for the majority.
Yeah, I'll just follow up on that as well. I mean, the Hercules project is amazing and a real kind of highlight of what can be achieved with the right resources and the right people involved in HTA sphere. But I think there's lots of different ways that patient groups can begin to develop and build up the rare disease the ecosystem around their condition, right? And a lot right now are focused on, getting that first animal model, or the first idea for a repurposing project, or the first thing to get things moving and started. But we need to increase education and awareness about HTA as a crucial part of that development of the ecosystem in your condition, and raise the profile of the concept that patient groups can have a huge impact by collecting accuracy data, or by thinking about endpoints for the disease that will ultimately lead to a better chance to develop effective treatments on the clinical pathway, which will then ultimately have a better chance for those treatments to be approved. So I think it's building that kind of approach that you guys at Hercules have kind of piloted into the awareness within the patient community to help, what Eric said earlier, really to help them think about that right at the start of the process. And it might be that one thing that they can do that makes a big difference down the line.
Can I just come in as well quickly then? I think I'm really enjoying listening to everybody speak, and obviously the expertise on this panel is incredible, and the insight that that people on this panel have got. I'm listening and I'm thinking about where the position that I was in 6 years ago when I didn't know anything about this process. And I think we have to remember that there are patient organisations out there who don't know anything about what you are talking about, yet they possess within them the expertise to be able to make, to be able to make better decisions. And I think it is fascinating listening to you all, and you know, it's so admirable how much you all know about it, but I just think that sometimes we don't meet the patient organisations where they are. We expect them to come up to the level that you are all at. And I qualify, my expertise lies in, because 6 years ago I didn't know anything about this and had to, on the back foot, represent a group of patients who didn't even have their own patient organisation. They were a group of patients. People didn't even know what the condition was until the treatment came along. And I think that there has to be different solutions to different types of patient organisations. And I totally respect a lot of what you've said, Eric, and also Emily, about the absolutely incredible things that patient organisations can do. Any patient organisation can do an incredible thing, but they have to be supported. And you know, it is a different language that we are all speaking. And I think that if we want patients to have a real impact in that, we have to change how we talk about it. I'll be quiet now, but I loved what you said about you know, that it doesn't have to be a Hercules sized project. You know, it can be you know, something small that patient group can impact. But I think that what is important to know is that we have to help patient groups understand what that is, because they won't know what it is that they've got that can be of influence, because it's just way too complicated and technical for them to understand. And I think that's where there's a real lack of translating that for patient groups. And be quiet now.
We have a comment or question from Jess, but Heidi, if you wanted to say something, because your hand is raised.
I would really love to come in on that. Lindsay, thank you. I wholeheartedly agree with what you've just said. And the last thing I would want any of us to do is put off either patient organisations or individual people participating by thinking they have to do this massive, scary, big thing and spend a lot of money. It really is, for the rest of us, nice, pharma, anybody else, to start speaking patient language. And there are so many different types of input and evidence, and they're on a continuum, from the mum sitting in a kitchen giving us her insight right through to Hercules. And you know, let's not say that one is in some ways better than others. Actually, that individual insight could give a light bulb moment that could turn everything around. And I think it's really important to recognise that. And we you know, we have sometimes when we're sitting in a committee that the company and the other evidence will have collected this, and the patient experts will sit there and go, but you have missed the most important thing to us. What about X? And it changes everything and how it's looked at. I'm not saying that happens all the time, but I think it's really important to bear that in mind. And it's so important what language we use, and that we keep trying to make it easier for patients to engage, rather than trying to get them to change to what we're doing. We need to get better at meeting halfway at least. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. And now we have a question from Jess. Go ahead.
More of a collection of observations as the leader of a patient group and also a patient. who is headed for the second committee meeting next Tuesday for a drug that was approved in 2017 and has been being assessed for more than 2 years. So my background included a little bit, one graduate course when I was doing a master's in public health on cost-benefit analysis, and I still had no idea what I'm doing. So not a history graduate like Emily, but having any academic background still doesn't really prepare you to do this. My thought is that if you have a patient group that is just coming in, not having done the Project Hercules and not having done the prep work, what you need is the sort of emergency services when they all of a sudden get the email that says the scoping is on the table. How do you get them up to speed really quickly? And Heidi and Mandy are great, but I think you need somebody outside of NICE to give the real sort of practical advice about what to do. So you need what I think of as, the ambulance comes in and says, let's get you where you need to go for this step, and then let's prepare you for all of the other input that you're going to need to do in the technical, phases of it and preparing for the committee meeting. So it's, we aren't all going to be, ready and doing the surveys 5 years early. And so I think the ambulance service needs to be designed to be really effective, really practical. We were very lucky in that Leukemia Care, which is a very experienced patient group, was also a stakeholder. And so they became kind of our mentors and helped us walk through this. But if we hadn't known to kind of reach out to them and make that connection, and they hadn't been as generous as Leukemia Care has been, we would have not been nearly as able to do what we did. And we still don't know. And I hope the TA folks also start giving the feedback to, rather than just HST, giving feedback to the patient groups about the ways in which they're being effective, because we have another drug coming and we don't know what we did right and what we did wrong in this assessment that we're still in the middle of. One thing I'm worried about with the new methods and process review is the shortening of the time scale for some of these processes, which was proposed because the patient groups need every precious day to try to get better at that. And so that's one thing that really caught my eye and worried me about the proposals on that. And I would say that the way in which patients are treated can be pretty off-putting. So for example, went into a meeting after scoping because it's a rare disease and nobody knew it. So we had a sort of impromptu meeting where the expert had seen one patient and NICE kept deferring to that person because that was the doctor. Whereas, I had consulted with 6 clinicians who had hundreds of patients and said, this is what they say people are actually treated with. And then the NICE folks would say again, yes, but clinical expert, what do you think? And that feels not quite right. And that was just a bad choice about who the clinical expert was. But it's an example of where we're included, but we're discounted, and that's kind of rubbish. And I think the other sort of obvious flag is when you're sent an email that says, if you really want to see the model, you can request it, but we won't automatically send it to you. And so the assumption is that it sort of feels like you're not supposed to want to look at the spreadsheets, that this is sort of not your turf. And I think that's just something that's easily fixed. Thanks.
Thank you, Jess. Josie?
Thank you. I won't come back on everything you've said, Jess, but thank you so much for sharing that. But just on that ambulance point, I think that's so important. It's one of the reasons Lindsay and I set up Realise Advocacy, because we were both individually finding people sort of come across us to be able to help. I'm sure Eric's had that same experience, but it's not systematic. So having events like this where hopefully more people will hear that there is some support out there, that the ambulances do exist, we just need to know where to go. And I'll leave it at that because I think we've got quite a few questions coming in, but thank you for sharing.
Yes, thank you very much. So we have a question from Vincent, but before that, there was a very interesting discussion in the chat where Janelle asked whether patient participation in the process should be funded or should be financially supported. So I would like to hear the panel's comments on that issue, particularly from Francis and maybe Josie and maybe Heidi. What do you think?
You're going first, Francis.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the question. And yeah, I mean, I did allude to the fact that these surveys can be quite expensive to conduct, right? And not every organisation is going to have the, the resources to, to conduct such a survey. Actually, you'd be surprised that, some of the companies as well will also, struggle to fund some of these surveys as well, right? But what I would say is that, even a kind of informal survey of the membership, right? A small survey of the membership of a patient organisation, that they conduct themselves. Start small. You don't actually have to, start big. You can syndicate the responses, right? And and use that as evidence, during a nice committee meeting, right? It's always going to be more powerful than individual testimonies or anecdotes. Companies are worth speaking with, right? If they have a particular interest in a disease area, either currently or in the future, to ask whether they would participate in funding a survey. It's always worth worth a try there. I mean, of course, if you are relying on donations for setting up your own survey, then you could have the low-tech form. It doesn't have to be I guess the Concord or surveys, right? And and it doesn't have to be the Project Hercules. I mean, it is an admirable project, right? And gold standard. But there are, you could start small and then over time, try to perhaps use the small survey as a pilot for a larger one, or you may get additional funding and so forth. So that's how I would approach it. Yeah.
So I'll jump in next and say I do disagree with Francis there. My answer is very simple. Yes, there absolutely should be funding. It is not fair in any system that the group with the most money and the loudest voices should be able to make more of an impact within HTA than the smallest group with the least understanding and the least resources. So I absolutely fundamentally think that there should be funding in order to level that up. And surveys are great, surveys are one thing, but actually what we've heard about is today and previously is that there's a lot more than just doing a survey. There's actually understanding, what is this process? How do I fit in? What's most important? What's this committee meeting like? What is an appeal? And really being able to practically understand what this big scary thing, the NICE process, actually means and how you can engage from where you're at, what you can do. And without funding, without some funding, I think it's really, really builds in those that inequity. You might remember, Francis, going back in time, the days of Agnes, right? So this is pre-NICE HST. We had something called the Advisory Group for National Specialised Services. And I was so proud of the fact that we actually invested money in supporting patients and patient groups to properly engage in that process. We had funding available to get a consultant to work with someone and actually be able to produce the best possible evidence that you could. So respectfully disagree with you, Francis, and I'll pass the baton on to Heidi, who may respectfully disagree with me, I think.
This is a tricky one, isn't it? Because obviously I have a very strong personal opinion. So at NICE, we do give patient experts an honorarium for taking part in technical engagement and taking part in the committee meeting, which I think is right and proper. And we also give our lay members an honorarium in the same way, which I also think is right and proper. Some years ago, we also used to give participating stakeholder organisations money to help them participate and it was up to them what they used it for. It wasn't just patient organisations, it could be clinical organisations as well. And it was up to them whether they used it for extra, admin, for surveys or whatever. Sadly, however, some years ago, that was stopped for all stakeholders, and sadly, from my perspective, there wasn't a big outcry from the patient community at the time. So that's the position we still find ourselves in.
Thank you, Heidi. So now I'd like to give the voice to Vince. So please go ahead with your question.
Hi there. Sorry, I represent the amyloidosis, UK Amyloidosis Patient Association, and I've been involved. It's just some observations of what you've been saying today. I got involved a few years ago in 2 HTA on very rare disease drugs that were available for us, and luckily for us, they were both approved. So, and then since then, I've been on other ones which are still going through, and some haven't been. But I honestly, at that time, a lot of people here today, at that time, I think we were kind of dropped into it because there was drugs available. We kind of said, well, we need to do something about this. We haven't been working with people before, and Eric would remember that. We were very reliant on Eric at the time to do surveys and things like that, and we were kind of trying to get somebody to be a patient expert alone was very difficult, because not all patients can be experts, because some people are not that side of person, and so within a small cohort of rare diseases you may not have a patient expert who can actually stand up or be representative at these meetings, because it is a very strenuous, very you've got to be compassionate about what you're doing, believe that this is the right thing to do, for not just for you, but for your family and for other people. And I think getting involved at an earlier stage is key for us as organizations, because it is very difficult to get your head around the fact that all these things have got to be, like Eric and Rick were saying, we have to meet the requirements of the rules and regulations of the committee. They're not meeting us in a way. We come up to them, and it can be very difficult. And especially a lot of these rare diseases, especially our disease, affects people in their older age, like in their 50s. And a lot of people just don't have the wherewithal or quality of life to support that. And also with technology, I got involved with another one where we had to find a patient who could talk, but just training them on Zoom, training them on all sorts of things took a long time. And I think, and also very key for patients in getting involved in experts is to have a good relationship with your doctors. And we did a lot of work. We were very lucky because we have the National Amyloid Centre. So, and I've known them so we were able to work with them and understand about the disease, what we needed in surveys. And I think that's very key. And it's come at a time now when I think we need support right at the beginning. And a lot of people don't get involved until we know there's a particular drug available, because it's like normal doctors. They won't prescribe if they won't diagnose something because there's no cure or there's no drug. So we're finding that a lot now, and luckily we have, and we know this phase, next phase, is we're trying to get cardiologists and all those people more involved in diagnosing this, and that's the next phase. But I think, don't get me wrong, it was very good, and I really enjoyed it, and NICE really looked after me. But at the end of the day, we are patients, we suffer, we have to travel. And I think the best thing with COVID is that I was able to join on Zoom, so I didn't have to travel to Manchester. I didn't have to, try and, time off. And, with our disease, you get really fatigued and stuff like that. So it's really having that help right at the beginning somebody, whether it's NICE or whether it's another agency, and I know it costs money, but without that, and I believe still that a patient expert on the committee, and I believe what we did made a huge difference to that committee meeting. Okay, and I think it changed. In some cases, it brought lots of people down because people are so involved in statistics and all that sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, quality of life and the day-to-day stuff that patients have to go through, and if you're not there to represent that, people don't recognise that human side of things, and I think that's very, 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 very powerful. Yeah,
thank you very much, Vince. You had fantastic participation in our scientific advice meeting, so it was extremely helpful for our learning and also in appraisal committees. We have a question from Anne, but before she asks her question, I have a controversial question for the panel, which is connected to the question which came up in the chat. So the question that came up in the chat was about whether it's acceptable to take funding from the industry. And my controversial question related to this, we know that patient organizations receive a lot of industry funding, and this does a lot of good, and this might not necessarily lead to positive outcomes. And today we talked about very positive steps that are necessary to support patients to make organizations work together. But we are aware of situations where strong patient lobbying can lead to negative consequences because lobbying goes for poorly evidenced drugs, the drugs that will not bring benefit to patients. And unfortunate situation there is a lot of these drugs might be coming to the market with simply very weak evidence, where even regulators who are about to deny them don't have strong enough data to act on that. So where do you stand on this, on the role of patient organizations or patients themselves? Because there's a huge emotional component. There's a conflict of interest of potential funding from the industry. And it's extremely difficult to make judgments and call names or call decisions in this setting.
Maybe I'll just jump in, Lisa. I think that it's a difficult question, as you've alluded to, and I think there's no one answer because there's so many circumstances in which it could or couldn't be appropriate. I think the way that I would think about it is whether or not a patient organization is funded by pharma or not, it's about behavior. It's about what is the strength, robustness, the appropriateness of the advocacy, because there's certain situations where I think patient groups need to do more in the context of HTA to push back at a pharmaceutical company for their engagement strategy or lack of, their pricing strategy, their commercial strategy, all of that stuff that negatively impacts on a HTA decision. And whether a patient group gets funded by pharma for that participation or not, it shouldn't stop them being a proper advocate and pushing back to any stakeholder that is standing in the way inappropriately of access. So I think it's more around, so I, in my career, various kind of patient groups have had a terrific working relationship with pharma, difficult and challenging at times, very honest, very frank, and have been funded by pharma to do things, but I don't think at any point it changed the way that we acted or behaved or advocated. Quite the opposite. So I think it's a bit of a cop-out, but it's not so much about the funding, it's about the credibility and the appropriateness of the advocacy that comes from patient groups.
Thank you. Josie, any comments? Anyone?
I'll just quickly add something then before Anne asks a question. Yeah, I agree with that, Eric. And I guess going back to my very first point on this webinar was, if the attitude is that patient voice is absolutely essential to this process and the preparation leading up to it, then it has to be funded by something or by someone. Otherwise, the attitude just isn't there. The drive just isn't there. Whether or not that's pharmaceutical companies, I think if it is agreed, that this is fundamental, then there will be a way to fund patient organisations ethically, without conflict, and the people will be driven to find out what that is and how to do that. So I think that, like Eric said, you could kind of, the pros and cons of being funded by a pharmaceutical company. But again, I think it's, if the drive is there, then there will be a way to do that in a responsible way.
And so sorry to keep talking, I apologize, but there's another angle to it as well. A lot of what I've done in my career is help charities with organizational development, and that involves looking at the strategic plan and how they allocate the scarce resources that they have. And all too often, this doesn't show up in their strategic plan. And it doesn't show up in their budget. So they have resources, and I'm not saying all patients and patient groups have resources at all to participate and do anything other than just give their time, which is amazing, but some do. And it's around how they prioritize the allocation of their scarce resources. So quite often there's a hefty budget in there proportionately for research. So funding some, a PhD or some lab thing or whatever, but actually you think, what benefit are you going to get for that 50 or 60,000 or 80,000 versus if you put that into an advocacy strategy or a patient level data evidence generation strategy. And lots of CEOs have trouble convincing their boards actually that this stuff's important, and actually we've got limited resources, but instead of funding 3 research grants, let's fund 2. And actually, let's allocate that 10 or 15,000 pounds to getting ready for advocacy, to do a bit of horizon scanning or whatever it might be. So I think it's a broader discussion, but I think it comes down also to, if you have resources, how do you allocate them? And should patient organizations be putting this in their strategy? And should they be convincing their boards to invest more in this kind of stuff and maybe pulling back from research equals hope stuff, where that investment's not going to make a massive difference to patients?
Thank you very much for everyone's comments. So we have 5 minutes left, and we're taking the last question or comment from Anne. So Anne, please go ahead.
Unfortunately, Elizabeth, you've given the last 5 minutes to an Irish person. I can't talk in just less than 5 minutes, so I'll have to speed up here. It's funny that was the topic that came up at the end, because that's the one I really wanted to talk about, the funding of patient organisations. And while an honorarium from NICE would be very nice, I'm sure, I think, as we've been highlighting, patient organisations need to be funded way back before you get to the day where you're sitting in front of NICE. You need to be funded months and years beforehand, and you have to find a proper balance of that funding. And it is not fair that that money is coming out of the pockets of people. Like, we have 3 main strands of income coming through this month. They're all to do with dead children, dead babies, dead toddlers. It's not fair that that money is funding doing an organisational job, where the first clinical trial that happened for our condition, I'm from the Myotubular Trust. Myotubular myopathy is a rare neuromuscular disorder where most of the children die before they're 1. You talk about a burden of care. It's a 24-hour-day job. 24 hours. No, if you take your eyes off that child, their airway will block off. So it's a 24-hour-day job. The very first clinical trial was a gene therapy. We thought it would be coming to NICE at the end of last year. Unfortunately, there were 3 deaths. The trial was put on hold. But the entrepreneur in residence from the investor company who came to see me years ago, at the end of the year before the deaths happened, cashed in and left with 55 million in personal income. Now, that's how we make change happen. We push it through like that. But at the same time, you can't tell our organizations, when there's that kind of money sloshing around in new companies, please don't ask for money, because we might not be able to trust what you say about drugs. We might not be able to believe you when you say that a drug works. And I'm really reminded of an analogy, and I am definitely telling this analogy. Sorry, Elizabeth, if I go over. When my son was little and we were applying for care hours at home, our wonderful physiotherapist used to go back to the community nurse and say, why don't you believe these parents? Do you think they want a nurse in their house overnight? Do you think they want a nurse sitting beside their child's bed as the only way to keep him alive when they get up in the morning? Why would they exaggerate his needs? Why, when you get up to go to the toilet in the middle of the night, do you want to bump into a nurse? Or, as the worst thing I used to hear was through a closed door, a suction machine going, and knowing someone was keeping my child alive, but I had to go to bed so I could keep him alive tomorrow. So why would you disbelieve people like that when you allocate them their care hours? Why would you disbelieve patient organizations because they happen to have a proportion of money from pharmaceutical companies when they come to you to say this drug works like this drug works like that? You gather other evidence, you gather data from other sources. It's not the only place you find out the proof of the working of a medicine. If we're going to say that the patient voice is essential, I have another given. We're going to believe the patient voice and not find reasons to doubt it because they happen to have a proportion of their money from pharmaceuticals. I believe that the pharma companies should be paying forward for the success of the drugs they're going to try in our very rare community. I don't mean 100%, but I found myself the year before the gene therapy was going to come to NICE, wondering if I should ask for another £10,000 from a pharmaceutical company in case I looked like we had too much money that came from pharma, trying to apply the EMA rule of no more than 30% of your income from no more than less than 3 organizations. Well, we're a rare disease. Finding 3 organizations who want to give us money is hard too. So you need some smarter rules about that to do with rare diseases. So my solution to that is I've got an audit trail you could pin your life on that shows what I say to both of those farmers that give us money at the moment. So you can absolutely see they get no favoritism from us, they get pushback from us. And if anyone wants to see, if by the time we come to NICE, we happen to have an income from pharma, if anyone wants to see how we communicate with pharma, I could probably give you a file that thick that demonstrates they get no favoritism, because why would they? We're trying to cure people, not get some random drug through HTA or HST. Sorry, that was not the original passion I intended to tell that story with, but I've got one other observation, which is it looks to me when you come to engage with HST or HTA that a whole load of magic stars have to align in the sky for you to be in the right place at the right time to get the right information. We were really lucky. Our magic star was that it was the first time that NICE ran their masterclass for HST. They're absolutely wonderful. We weren't even pushing an open door. We were falling through an open door. Heidi, Mandy, they could not have been more helpful. What we all say about the health is absolutely true. Secondly, Lindsay was in the same room as me. So from then on, Lindsay was available to give us help. She'd already experienced it. I then go to a Metabolic UK conference and Josie's presenting, and now Josie's helping us. But how do we codify that? How do you make that work for all organizations? I feel our stars were aligned, but you shouldn't need stars aligned to make the patient organization a useful input to reimbursement. Sorry, I told you I was Irish.
And thanks so much. Very emotive and very important comments. Completely hear you, and I think very interesting is that scope for rare diseases and scope for non-rare diseases and patient involvement actually differs. And I think the provision for rare diseases are very different. So we need to definitely have, cannot apply one rule to all. So really amazing reflection. So last set of comments from the panel before we round up the discussion.
Just very fine. I mean, I think that the most important message here is about reflecting the heterogeneity in patients and patient organizations. And as Emily very rightly said, we've got Hercules at one end, and then as Lindsay and Heidi said, we've got, you know, a single patient new to this, plucked out of thin air. One day they're going along just fine, next day they're a patient, and just trying to navigate that spectrum and have appropriate support, information, education for that spectrum, I think seems to me to be really, really critical, so that no matter where we are on that spectrum, we're not scared, we can participate to the extent that we can, and make the most of the opportunities we have, irrespective of where we are on that spectrum. But generally, we should be trying to move people to the middle. You know, we've got to try and help improve and skill people up to be more effective participants in HTA in its broadest definition.
Thank you, Eric. Josie, any final words?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you everyone for joining today. I think absolutely take on board what Anne said. You know, we should not wait for the stars to align. It shouldn't be just down to luck for a patient organisation to stumble across support from Realise Advocacy or Eric or Rick or Heidi. We need to have a more systematic approach so that everyone can access at least some support and know where to start and know how to engage and understand what it might mean for them in their situation. So I think that that heterogeneity, Eric, is great, but we need to find a way to not make finding help accidental. Thank you.
Thank you, Josie. I thank our panel for sharing their experiences, sharing their thoughts. The recording of this session will be available on our YouTube channel. We would love to hear your feedback, other events that you'd like to host, we would like us to see host. And I appreciate your time, I appreciate your questions, and have a lovely afternoon. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.